The creation of the world. A story narrated according to the Holy Bible. In the beginning, before time began its infinite count, before the first spark of light broke through the primordial darkness, before the faintest whisper of sound echoed through the void, absolutely nothing of what we know today existed. There was no deep blue sky stretched like a canopy over the earth. There were no majestic mountains tearing through the clouds with their snowy peaks. There were no vast and mysterious oceans guarding secrets in their abyssal depths. There was not even a single star twinkling in the immensity of the cosmos. There was only God. He existed in perfect fullness, eternal as no human concept can express, powerful beyond any measure or comparison, sovereign over all that would come to exist. Nothing limited him in his power. Nothing preceded him in his existence. He was, is, and always will be the One, the Most High, the one who dwells in eternity and transcends all understanding. The Holy Scriptures begin with seemingly simple words, yet laden with a depth that spans millennia. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. These words, written thousands of years ago, mark the absolute beginning of everything that exists, of everything we can see with our eyes and touch with our hands, and also of that which remains invisible to human senses, but no less real. From the material to the spiritual, from the atom to the galaxy, everything had its beginning in that incomprehensible moment. This is the story of the creation of the world, faithfully narrated according to the book of Genesis. A narrative of immeasurable power, of order emerging from chaos, of beauty being woven in the void, and of a love so immense that it decided to create everything that exists simply to share this fullness with other beings. The earth, in that initial moment impossible to fully comprehend, did not yet possess a defined form. It was like a shapeless mass, without recognizable contours, without structure or organization. The void completely characterized it. Deep, dark, dense, and mysterious waters covered its entire surface like an impenetrable cloak. They were not the crystalline waters we know, reflecting the sun in their dancing waves. They were primordial waters, opaque, lifeless, without movement of their own beyond a slow and heavy swaying, like an ocean that had been asleep forever. Darkness dominated everything absolutely. It was not simply the absence of light, as we experience at night, when the stars still shine timidly, and the moon lends its silvery reflection. It was a complete, total, impenetrable darkness. A darkness so dense that it seemed to have substance, as if it could be touched, as if it were a black fabric covering all the still non-existent reality. Nothing could be distinguished, for there was no reference, no contrast, nothing beyond that absolute blackness that enveloped everything. But even in that scene of chaos and emptiness, something extraordinary was happening. The Spirit of God, as a majestic and mysterious presence, moved gently over the face of those deep waters. It hovered like a bird over its nest, carefully and purposefully preparing for what was to come. There was expectation in that movement, there was intention, there was love. It was as if all of creation was being incubated, warmed, prepared for birth. Then, in that eternal instant that would change everything forever, God spoke. And when God speaks, when his voice resounds through nothingness, the impossible bows before his power. Mountains would bend like wax, seas would part like curtains, and reality itself would rearrange itself according to his word. Let there be light. Just two words. Simple, direct, powerful, and there was light. Instantly, without delay or gradation, light exploded into existence. It wasn't a gradual sunrise, painting the horizon with shades of orange and pink. It was a sudden, full, glorious manifestation. The light broke through the darkness like thunder breaks through the silence, bringing luminous clarity where before there was only impenetrable chaos and absolute confusion. It was a pure, intense, radiant light, unlike any light we have ever contemplated. A light that did not come from any physical source, but simply was because God so ordained. Imagine that moment, the first light that ever existed, shining with an intensity impossible to describe, illuminating those primordial waters that now reflected this splendor for the first time. Where there was only impenetrable darkness, now there was clarity. Where there was only a black and hopeless void, now there was brilliance and possibility. For the first time in existence, there was contrast. There was distinction. Order was beginning to emerge from the chaos. God then, with his infinite wisdom, separated the light from the darkness, establishing boundaries and creating rhythm. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Two distinct realities, two different experiences, both necessary, both created with purpose. The day for work, for vision, for activity, for life to unfold. The night for rest, for reflection, for renewal, for contemplative silence. Thus ended the first day of creation. The afternoon passed slowly. The morning came with its renewed brightness, and a cycle was established. The first cycle of history. The first day of all the days to come. It is important to note something profound and wonderful. It was not the sun that created that first light. The sun did not yet exist. It would only be created on the fourth day. The light was born directly from the word of the Creator, demonstrating that God does not depend on the means we know to accomplish his purposes. He is the original source of all light, both physical and spiritual. He is the light before the light. He is the beginning before the beginning. On the second day, with the light already established and the rhythm of time beginning its infinite march between day and night, God spoke again. His voice, which had brought light into existence the previous day, would now shape space in a completely new and surprising way. He commanded the waters to be separated. Those primordial waters that covered everything, that stretched in all directions without apparent end, began to divide in a way that defied what we know about physics and nature. It was as if an invisible but infinitely powerful hand was pulling the waters in opposite directions, creating something never before seen. Some waters were kept below, forming what would become the deep seas, the vast oceans that would cover much of the planet, the meandering rivers that would cut through the future Earth like veins of life. Other waters, miraculously and inexplicably by the natural laws that were yet to be established, were lifted high, suspended above an immense expanse that God was creating at that very moment. Imagine the grand scene, enormous masses of water above, suspended as if attached to an invisible ceiling, reflecting the light created on the first day with a mysterious bluish glow. Below, more masses of water, dark and deep, awaiting their final destiny. And between them, separating them like a great luminous void, a gigantic space, a vastness that stretched in all directions. It was as if God had opened a bubble in the middle of the waters, creating a completely new environment, a place where life could eventually breathe and flourish. To this grand expanse, to this immense space created between the upper and lower waters, God gave a special name. He called it heaven. Not just the blue sky we see when we look up on a sunny day, but the entire atmosphere that would envelop our planet, the entire expanse that would separate the Earth from the cosmos beyond it, all the air that would be breathed, all the wind that would blow, every cloud that would float. Now there was room for the life to come. There was room to breathe, to move, to exist. There was air, even without the beings that would breathe it. There was order where before there had only been chaos. There was structure where before there had only been confusion. The world, which had begun as a shapeless mass covered in dark waters, now had defined layers, had clear organization, had a visible architectural purpose. Imagine being there at that moment on that second day and witnessing for the first time the sky forming. The expanse opening like a gigantic fan, the waters dividing as if obeying an invisible but powerful hand. Above, waters, miraculously suspended, shining with divine light. Below, waters patiently awaiting their destiny. In the middle, space, air, possibility, promise. And God contemplated what he had made. He observed with satisfaction that perfect separation, that emerging order. He saw the structure he was building. He saw the purpose unfolding. And he recognized that this was good. Not yet complete, for creation would continue for the next few days with even more marvelous works, but good, adequate, correct. A solid and firm step in the direction of the divine plan that would be fully revealed only on the sixth day. On the third day, something extraordinary would happen. For the first time since the beginning of creation, we would see not one, but two great works in the same 24-hour period. It was as if God, satisfied with the foundations established in the first 2 days, now accelerated his creative work with a growing and contagious enthusiasm. First, God turned his attention to those waters that remained below the expanse created on the second day. They still covered everything, still hid what lay beneath that dark, liquid surface. With his powerful voice, the same voice that had called light into existence, God commanded these waters to gather in specific places. Not that all the waters of the world would become a single ocean, but that they would come together, organize themselves, define their limits and boundaries. And when the waters obeyed that divine command, receding and accumulating in immense depressions and basins that God had prepared, something truly marvelous was revealed. Dry land appeared for the first time. Imagine the majestic scene. Waters receding like curtains being slowly pulled back, revealing what had been hidden beneath from the beginning. First, perhaps the tops of the future highest mountains, emerging as solitary islands in the middle of the vast ocean. Then, hills revealing themselves one after another, connecting to each other like a giant jigsaw puzzle being assembled. Enormous plains stretching as far as the eye could see, with their red, brown, and gray earth still virgin. Deep valleys forming between rocky elevations. Gorges opening up like wounds on the surface. The dry land in all its potential and diversity, finally visible, finally accessible, finally ready to fulfill its purpose in the grand plan of creation. God called the dry part land, and the gathering of the waters he named seas. Now, there was an absolutely clear distinction. There were visible boundaries, there were established limits, there was a diversity of environments. The seas stretched out in their deep blue immensity, their waters moving in rhythmic waves that began to skirt the newly formed coasts, gently licking the sand that had never been touched. The land stood firm in its brown, gray, and reddish solidity, waiting patiently, like a blank canvas awaiting the artist's brushstrokes for what would come next. And God contemplated this perfect division between land and sea, between the solid and the liquid, between two kingdoms that would coexist in harmony. He saw that it was good, but God was not finished with the third day. He gazed at that dry land, still arid, still devoid of any form of life, still silent and barren, and spoke again. Let the earth bring forth vegetation. It was a different order from the previous ones. God was not creating something directly from nothing this time, as he had done with light. He was endowing the earth itself with the capacity to produce, to generate, to give life. It was as if he were injecting creative power into the very substance of the soil, making it fertile, making it alive, making it capable of generating other forms of life. And the earth, like everything else in creation, obeyed immediately. Plants began to emerge from the soil. First, perhaps, small green shoots breaking through the surface of the brown earth, timid but determined. Then, in an explosion of life and color that must have been breathtaking, trees began to grow in all directions. They did not grow slowly as we see today, taking years to reach their maturity. They grew instantly, or in a matter of hours, reaching their full and glorious form by divine command. Imagine the transformation. What was once a brown and gray desert was suddenly covered in vibrant green. Grasses sprouted, forming soft carpets. Shrubs spread out, their leaves swaying in the breeze that began to blow. Immense trees rose towards the sky, with robust trunks and leafy canopies. Flowers of every imaginable color adorned the ground like jewels scattered on green velvet. Red roses, white lilies, yellow sunflowers, purple violets, white daisies with golden centers, an explosion of colors that had never existed before. Each plant carried its own seed, ensuring that it would multiply and perpetuate through generations. Each tree produced its specific fruit. Apple trees with red and juicy apples, orange trees with round and fragrant oranges, vines with bunches of purple and green grapes, fig trees with sweet and nutritious figs. The diversity was impressive, the abundance overwhelming. The world, which moments before was empty, barren, and silent, was now full of plant life. There were colors where before there had only been shades of gray and brown. There was the scent of flowers where before there had only been the smell of wet earth. There was the promise of food, of beauty, of life-sustaining life. And God contemplated all this, the dry land emerging from the waters, the seas gathering in their designated places, the vegetation covering the earth with its green and colorful mantle, and saw that everything was very good. Not just good, but very good. Creation was taking shape in a magnificent way. On the fourth day, God turned his attention to the sky that he had created on the second day. That immense expanse that separated the upper waters from the lower ones, that vast space that was now ready to receive something special. God would create the great luminaries that would govern day and night, that would mark time and the seasons for all eternity. First, God created the sun, not as a small, distant light, but as a gigantic sphere of fire and energy, shining with an intensity impossible to look directly at. The sun was positioned at a perfect distance from the earth, neither so close that it would burn everything with its scorching heat, nor so far that it would leave everything frozen in an eternal winter. It was placed exactly where it needed to be to govern the day, to warm the earth, to nourish the plants with its light, to establish the cycle that would allow life to flourish. Imagine the moment when the sun was lit for the first time. The light that had existed since the first day, the divine light that came from no source, now had a physical bearer. The sun exploded into existence with all its golden splendor, illuminating the earth in a new and wonderful way. Its rays spread across the entire surface of the planet, touching the mountains, the valleys, the seas, the newly created plants. Everything shone under that warm and welcoming light. Then, God created the moon to rule the night, not as bright as the sun, but with its own serene, silvery beauty. The moon was made to reflect the sun's light during the dark hours, to bring a soft glow when the day ended. It would be a beacon in the night, guiding future travelers, marking the months with its phases, influencing the ocean tides with its silent gravitational pull. Imagine the moon appearing in the sky for the first time, a perfectly round sphere, shining with a silvery glow against the blackness of space, its surface marked by craters and mountains that only enhanced its mysterious beauty. But God didn't stop with the sun and the moon. He looked at the vast expanse of a night sky and decided to fill it with countless points of light. Stars, thousands of them, millions of them, billions of them, each one placed in its specific place by the hand of God. Each one with its own brilliance, its own color, its own story. Imagine the night sky being filled with stars. First a few, then more, then thousands appearing simultaneously like silent fireworks, until the entire celestial vault was studded with luminous points. Constellations were formed, the Southern Cross with its perfect cross, Orion with its belt of 3 stars, the Big Dipper always pointing north. The Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the sky, showing the immensity of God's creation. These luminaries were not created solely for beauty, although they were incredibly beautiful. They would serve to mark times, days, seasons, and years. The sun would mark each day with its rising and setting. The moon would mark the months with its waxing and waning phases. The stars would help mark the seasons, changing their positions in the sky as the Earth rotated in its orbit. Together, they would create a perfect cosmic clock, never failing, never running late, always accurate. None of these lights appeared by chance. No star formed randomly. Each one was intentionally placed by God in its designated place. The universe was not the result of a chaotic explosion, but of intelligent and purposeful design. And God looked at the sun ruling the day with its golden glow, at the moon ruling the night with its silvery light, at the countless stars twinkling in the vastness, and saw that it was good. The sky was now complete, illuminated, alive with light and movement. On the 5th day, God turned his gaze to 2 regions that until then had remained empty despite all his preparation: the waters of the deep seas and the expanse of the heavens that stretched over the earth. It was time to fill them with living creatures, with movement, with sounds, with the joy of animal life. God spoke, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." And instantly, the seas that had been empty and silent since their creation began to teem with life of all shapes and sizes. Fish of every color appeared in the waters. Tiny silvery fish swam in enormous schools, moving as a single shimmering entity beneath the surface. Tropical fish with vibrant colors, electric blues, bright yellows, flaming oranges, neon greens, swimming among what would become future coral reefs. Large, powerful fish like tuna and marlin cutting through the waters with impressive speed. But it wasn't just fish. Even larger creatures were created to inhabit the depths of the oceans. Gigantic whales, the largest animals that would ever exist, began to swim through the seas, their songs echoing through the waters like mysterious symphonies. Dolphins leaped joyfully, playing in the waves with an intelligence evident in their bright eyes. Sharks patrolled the deeper waters with their predatory grace. Octopuses moved with their 8 tentacles, changing color to camouflage themselves. Jellyfish floated like transparent ghosts, pulsing with hypnotic beauty. The darkest depths of the oceans also gained their own creatures, bizarre and wondrous beings that glowed with their own bioluminescent light, perfectly adapted to live where sunlight never reached. Imagine the oceans transformed. What were once empty and silent waters were now teeming with life, movement, and color. Schools of thousands of fish moving in perfect synchronicity. Whales surfacing to breathe, launching columns of water into the air. Dolphins leaping in graceful arcs. Sea turtles swimming serenely. The sea had become a cradle of unparalleled life. Simultaneously, the skies were also being filled with life. Birds of every kind began to emerge and fly for the first time. Majestic eagles with enormous wings glided on the air currents, their keen eyesight capable of spotting a mouse miles away. Tiny hummingbirds, no bigger than a thumb, beat their wings so rapidly that they became a blur, hovering in the air as they sipped nectar from flowers. Songbirds filled the air with their melodies, nightingales, canaries, thrushes, each with its own unique and beautiful song. Colorful parrots flew in noisy flocks, their green, red, and blue plumage shimmering in the sun. Waterfowl were also created, ducks swimming gracefully in lakes, geese flying in perfect V formations, pelicans diving into the waters to fish, pink flamingos balancing on one leg. Birds of prey, such as hawks and owls, were given sharp talons and exceptional eyesight. Each bird was perfectly adapted to its environment and purpose. The sky, which had been empty except for the sun, moon, and stars, was now teeming with life. Wings flapping, feathers glistening in the sun, songs echoing, shadows moving across the earth below. It was a spectacle of movement and beauty. And God not only created these creatures from the waters and the skies, He personally blessed them, saying to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the waters of the seas and let birds multiply on the earth." It was a blessing of abundance, of continuity, of life generating more life. The fish would have offspring, the birds would hatch eggs, and life would spread throughout the planet. And God contemplated the seas, teeming with creatures of all shapes, sizes, and colors. He looked at the skies filled with birds flying, singing, living, and He saw that it was good. Creation was almost complete. Only one day remained, a very special day, when God would create His masterpiece. The 6th day dawned with the same glorious light as the previous days, but there was an anticipation in the air, as if all of creation knew that something special was about to happen. God would turn His attention to the dry land, that place covered in green and colorful vegetation, but still empty of earthly creatures. First, God created the animals of the earth in all their impressive diversity. Domestic animals emerged, sheep with their soft wool bleating gently, cows grazing calmly in the green fields, goats climbing rocks with surprising agility, horses galloping freely with their manes in the wind, loyal and friendly dogs, independent and graceful cats. Then came the wild animals, each unique and wonderful in its own way. Majestic lions with their golden manes roaring their authority over the savannah. Gigantic elephants walking with earth-shaking strides, their intelligence evident in their wise eyes. Giraffes with their impossibly long necks reaching the highest leaves of the trees. Zebras with their perfectly symmetrical black and white stripes. Powerful bears, striped tigers, spotted leopards, howling wolves, cunning foxes, leaping squirrels. Even more exotic creatures were created. Rhinoceroses with their impressive horns, hippos grazing on riverbanks, crocodiles lurking in shallow waters, monkeys swinging from branch to branch in the forests that were beginning to form, sloths hanging upside down, kangaroos hopping across the land that would one day become Australia. Reptiles of all shapes also emerged. Snakes slithering silently through the grass, lizards basking in the sun, chameleons changing color to camouflage themselves, tortoises carrying their homes on their backs, iguanas resting on the warm rocks. Even the insects were created that day, bees working tirelessly, ants building their complex anthills, colorful butterflies fluttering from flower to flower, crickets singing their nocturnal songs, fireflies illuminating the nights with their magical lights. The earth, which had been silent, was now filled with sounds, roars, howls, barks, meows, bleats, moos, whistles, trills. It was full of movement, animals running, jumping, crawling, climbing. It was full of life in its most diverse and wonderful expression. Each animal was created according to its kind, with unique characteristics and specific purposes. Carnivores with sharp teeth and powerful claws. Herbivores with flat teeth for grinding plants. Some fast, some slow. Some large, some tiny. But all perfect in their design, all suited to their environment. And God looked at all this diversity of animal life and saw that it was good. But something was still missing. Creation was almost complete, but not entirely. There was a void, an absence. None of the creatures created up to that point could truly know God, relate to Him, consciously worship Him, reflect His attributes. It was then that God said something completely different from everything He had said until then. For the first time in all of creation, God did not simply say, "Let there be," or "produce." For the first time, He spoke as if in counsel, in consultation, in profound decision. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." It was a solemn, sacred moment, unique in the entire creation narrative. God was about to create something that would be fundamentally different from everything else. Not just another creature, but a creature made in His own image. And God formed man. He did not merely speak a word for him to instantly appear. God knelt down, so to speak, and with His own hands molded man from the dust of the earth, from that same red and brown soil from which plants grow. They grew. Like a potter working with clay, God carefully formed each part, the head, the torso, the arms, the hands with their delicate fingers, the legs, the feet. He formed the internal organs, each with its specific function. He formed the brain, capable of complex and profound thoughts. He formed the eyes to see the beauty of creation. He formed the ears to hear the sounds of a world. He formed the mouth to speak, to communicate, to express thoughts and emotions. But there, lying on the garden floor, was only an inert body, perfect in its form but lifeless, without movement, without consciousness. Then came the most intimate and sacred moment of all creation. God leaned over that clay body and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life. It was not just air, but the very divine breath, the spirit of life coming directly from God. And man became a living soul. His eyes opened for the first time. His lungs filled with air. His heart began to beat. Blood began to flow through his veins. He blinked, looking around with admiration and amazement. He moved his fingers, testing them. He rose from the ground where he had been formed, standing upright for the first time, unlike all the other animals. His name was Adam, which means formed from the earth, or red man, referring to the soil from which he was created. God looked at Adam with paternal love. Here was his masterpiece, his most special creation. A being made in God's image, capable of thinking, choosing, loving, creating, and worshiping. A being with whom God could have true communion. Then God prepared a special place for Adam to live. He did not place him just anywhere on earth, but planted a garden in Eden, in the east. This garden was unlike any other place on the planet. It was paradise in its purest and most perfect expression. The Garden of Eden was a place of indescribable beauty. Majestic trees grew everywhere, not only fruit trees with their delicious fruits, but ornamental trees with lush, fragrant flowers. Crystal clear rivers meandered through the garden, their waters so pure they could be drunk directly. The banks of these rivers were covered with green grass as soft as carpet. Flowers of every imaginable color grew in profusion, roses, lilies, orchids, jasmines filling the air with their sweet perfumes. There was a main river that originated in Eden and then divided into 4 branches, irrigating the entire garden and the surrounding lands. The climate was perfect, neither too hot nor too cold, always pleasant. Sunlight filtered through the treetops, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Birds sang their most beautiful melodies. Peaceful animals grazed together, without fear of one another, for there was still no violence or predation. In the center of the garden, God placed two very special trees: the tree of life, whose fruit granted immortality, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which would be a test of obedience and trust. God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden to care for it and cultivate it. He gave him authority over all creation. He brought all the animals to Adam so that he could name them, exercising his authority and demonstrating his intelligence. And Adam named each creature, each animal, each bird, each living creature received its name from Adam. But while Adam was naming the animals, something became evident. Each animal had its mate. The lions had lionesses. The eagles had their mates. The sheep had their rams. But for Adam, a suitable companion could not be found. God, who already knew this from the beginning, said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." Then God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. It was not an ordinary sleep, but a kind of divine trance. While Adam slept soundly, God performed the first surgery in history. He took one of his ribs, closed the place with flesh, and from the rib, he formed the woman. She was not made from the dust of the earth like Adam, but from his own body, showing that they were of the same essence, equal in value and dignity. She was not made from his head to dominate him, nor from his feet to be trampled on, but from his side, near his heart, to be loved and protected. When Adam awoke and saw the woman for the first time, it was instant love. He exclaimed with joy, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Her name was Eve, which means mother of all living, for from her would be born all future humanity. God blessed them both together. He did not bless just Adam, but Adam and Eve as a unit. He said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth." It was a commission, a purpose, a calling. They were to have children, populate the earth, and care for God's creation as faithful stewards. They had authority over every living creature, but was an authority of care and protection, not of exploitation or cruelty. God also gave them abundant provision. He said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. They will be yours for food." There was no hunger in Eden. There was no scarcity. There was abundance everywhere. Delicious fruits hung from the trees, ready to be picked. Vegetables grew in the gardens. There was fresh, pure water to drink. All needs were completely met. Adam and Eve walked through the garden in perfect innocence. They were naked, but they felt no shame, for there was no sin, no malice, nothing wrong between them. They spoke freely with God, who came to walk with them in the garden in the cool of the day. There was perfect communion between the Creator and His creatures. Adam's work was not arduous or tiring. It was pleasurable, meaningful. He cared for the garden with joy, pruning here, planting there, harvesting ripe fruits. Eve was by his side, his perfect companion, working with him, talking with him, laughing with him. There was no pain. There was no sadness. There was no death. There were no tears. There was no loneliness. There was no fear. It was paradise in its truest and most complete sense. And God looked at all that He had made during those 6 days of creation. He looked at the light and the darkness. He looked at the sky, separating the waters. He looked at the dry land and the seas. He looked at the vegetation covering the earth. He looked at the sun, the moon, and the stars. He looked at the fish in the seas and the birds in the skies. He looked at the land animals in all their diversity. And He looked at man and woman, made in His image, living in the perfect garden He had prepared for them. And God saw that everything was very good. Not just good, but very good. Perfect, complete, exactly as planned from before the foundation of the world. On the seventh day, something different happened. God created nothing new. The work of creation was complete, finished, perfect. Everything that needed to exist already existed. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. Then God rested, not because He was tired or exhausted. The Creator of the universe does not tire. He who holds the stars in their places does not need physical rest. Isaiah the prophet would write centuries later, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary." God rested not out of necessity, but to establish an eternal principle, a pattern for his creatures to follow. Rest, pause, time to contemplate, time to reflect, time for communion. Imagine that seventh day in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve not working, but resting, appreciating all that God had created. Perhaps they walked slowly through the garden, admiring each tree, each flower, each creature. Perhaps they sat by the riverbank, listening to the gentle sound of the flowing water, feeling the cool breeze on their faces. Perhaps they looked at the sky, marveling at the white clouds floating against the perfect blue, or at the stars twinkling at night. And perhaps in the cool of the day, when the air was freshest, God walked with them, not as a distant and inaccessible God, but as a father conversing with his children, explaining his creation to them, answering their questions, laughing with them, delighting in their company. The seventh day was blessed by God in a special way. He sanctified it, set it apart as holy, as different from the other days. It was not just another day in the cycle of time. It was a holy day, a day dedicated to rest, contemplation, worship, and communion. This principle of rest would later be incorporated into the 10 Commandments that God would give to Moses on Mount Sinai. The Sabbath, the day of rest, would be a constant reminder of that first week of creation, a memorial of God's creative power and the importance of rest. But the rest of the seventh day also pointed to something greater. It pointed to a future rest, a spiritual rest that would come through Jesus Christ. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews would explain that there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, a final and eternal rest where there would be no more arduous work, no more weariness, no more struggle, only perfect rest in the presence of God. On the seventh day, creation was complete. The heavens declared the glory of God. The firmaments proclaimed the work of his hands. The earth was full of his goodness, and everything was very good. Thus ends the narrative of the creation of the world as recorded in the first chapter of Genesis. 6 days of creative work culminating in a day of sacred rest. From nothing to everything, from chaos to order, from emptiness to fullness, from darkness to light. But this story is much more than a simple account of how the world began. It reveals profound truths about God, about ourselves, and about the purpose of existence. First, we learn that creation was not an accident. It was not the result of random and purposeless processes. It was not the product of blind chance operating over infinite eons. It was the work of an intelligent, powerful, loving, and intentional God. Every aspect of creation was planned. Every detail was thought out. Every creature was designed with purpose. Second, we learn that there is order in the universe because there is a God of order. The laws of physics that govern the movement of the planets, the laws of chemistry that determine how atoms combine, the laws of biology that regulate life, all these laws exist because they were established by a lawgiver. The universe is not chaotic. It is ordered, predictable, understandable, because it was created by an ordered mind. Third, we learn that we are special. Of all the creatures created by God, the countless stars, the fish in the seas, the birds in the skies, the animals on the earth, only human beings were made in the image of God. Only we receive the divine breath of life. Only we have the capacity to know our Creator, to relate to Him, to reflect His attributes of love, creativity, justice, and mercy. This gives us unparalleled dignity. No matter what the world says about you, no matter how you feel about yourself, this truth remains. You were created in the image of Almighty God. You are not an accident. You are not insignificant. You are not worthless. You are loved, planned, and created with purpose. Fourth, we learn that God is a God of abundance and generosity. He did not create the world as an austere prison, but as a lush garden. He did not create only what is necessary for survival, but filled the earth with beauty, color, variety, and pleasure. Flowers are not just functional, they are beautiful. The sunset is not just the end of the day, it is a spectacle of colors. Birds not only exist, they sing. God could have created a monochromatic and functional world, but He chose to create a world full of beauty because He is good and generous. Fifth, we learn that work is good and meaningful. God did not create Adam to be idle in the garden, but to care for it and cultivate it. Work is not a curse, but a blessing when done according to God's purpose. We were created to be productive, to create, to care for God's creation. Work gives us purpose and meaning. Sixth, we learn that rest is essential. God rested himself on the seventh day, not out of weakness, but to teach us that we are more than just workers. We are relational beings who need time to contemplate, to reflect, to connect with God and with each other. A life without rest is an unbalanced life. Seventh, we learn that God desires fellowship with us. He did not create man and then abandoned him. He walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. He talked to them. He had a relationship with them. And even today, despite everything that has happened since, God still seeks to have fellowship with his children. The same powerful voice that said, "Let there be light," and there was light, the same voice that called the stars into existence, and they obeyed, the same voice that breathed life into Adam's nostrils, that same voice still speaks to human hearts today. It speaks through the creation that surrounds us, declaring the glory of God. It speaks through the Holy Scriptures, revealing God's will. It speaks through the Holy Spirit, touching our consciences and drawing us to God. And this story of creation does not end in the Garden of Eden. It continues through the pages of the Bible. We know that Adam and Eve sinned, disobeying the only command God had given them. We know that sin brought death, pain, and separation from God. The perfect garden was lost. Perfect communion was broken. But God did not abandon his creation. The story continues with the promise of redemption. Soon after the sin, God promised that a Savior would come, a descendant of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. This promise was fulfilled thousands of years later when Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was born in Bethlehem. Jesus came to restore what was lost in Eden. He came to reconcile humanity with God. Through his death on the cross and resurrection, he opened a way back to God. And one day, as the Scriptures promise, there will be new heavens and a new earth. Paradise will be restored. Communion with God will be complete again. There will be no more death, nor mourning, nor crying, nor pain, for the former things will have passed away. Creation, therefore, is the beginning of a larger story. It is the prologue to a narrative that includes fall and redemption, judgment and grace, separation and reconciliation. It is a story that is being written even today, and you are part of it. When we look around us at the blue sky above, at the green earth below, at the mountains in the distance, at the vast oceans, at the trees swaying in the wind, at the birds flying, at the stars twinkling at night, we are seeing the work of God's hands. Every detail of creation proclaims that there is a creator. Every flower testifies to a designer. Every star declares his glory. And when we look in the mirror, we see something even more wonderful. We see the image of God. Imperfect because of sin, yes. Broken by the fall, certainly. But still, the image remains. We still have value. We still have purpose. We are still loved by our Creator. The God who created the universe with a word, who painted the sunset with glorious colors, who sculpted the mountains and filled the seas, who counted the stars and called each one by name. That same God knows you. He created you. He loves you. He has a purpose for your life. Creation reminds us that we are not here by chance. We are not products of random, meaningless processes. We are intentional creations of a loving God. And just as God looked at his creation and said, "It is very good," he looks at you with the same love and approval. May this story of creation fill your heart with wonder for the Creator. May it give you hope, knowing that you were created with purpose. May it inspire you to care for God's creation as faithful stewards. May it remind you to rest as God rested. And may it point you to the Savior, Jesus Christ, who came to restore all that was lost. The story began with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But it doesn't end there. It continues with you, with your life, with your choices, with your response to the Creator who loves you. May God, the Creator of heaven and earth, bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and give you peace. And may you always remember that you were created in God's image, with purpose, with value, and with an eternal destiny. This is the story of the creation of the world according to the Holy Bible. A story of power, order, beauty, and love. A story that began in the beginning and continues to this day, a story of which you are a part. Amen. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In the beginning of all things, when the universe was still young and the newborn creation pulsed with divine glory, God molded a masterpiece that would be the home of humanity. After separating light from darkness, forming the heavens and gathering the waters to make dry land appear, after filling the seas with creatures and the skies with birds, after populating the earth with animals of every kind, the Creator prepared for his most sublime work, to create beings in his own image and likeness. The soil was reddish-brown, rich and fertile, holding within it the potential for all plant life. God bent down like a potter before his wheel, and with his divine hands took the dust of the earth. It was not just any dust, but the very substance of creation, the elements that made up that newly formed world. With infinite care and eternal purpose, he molded the human body. Every detail was carefully formed: the eyes that would contemplate the beauty of creation, the hands that would touch and transform the world, the feet that would walk through gardens and valleys, the heart that would beat with a life of its own. There, on the still virgin earth, lay a perfect form, complete in its anatomy, but still inert, still without the spark that would make it truly alive. Then, in a gesture of absolute intimacy, God approached that form and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life. It was not simply air, but the very divine essence, the breath that contained life, consciousness, soul, and spirit. The instant that divine breath entered that body of clay, something extraordinary happened. Adam opened his eyes. For the first time, human eyes contemplated creation. For the first time, a human heart beat. For the first time, human lungs expanded with air. Adam stood up, alive, conscious, created in the image of God himself, bearer of rationality, creativity, the capacity to love and to choose. He was a living being, unique in all creation. God did not place Adam just anywhere, but prepared for him a dwelling worthy of his most special creation. In the east, in a region that would be known as Eden, which means delight or pleasure, the Lord planted a garden. It was not an ordinary garden, but an earthly paradise of indescribable beauty. The trees that grew there were majestic and diverse. There were towering trees whose canopies seemed to touch the sky, with trunks so wide that several men could not embrace them. Their foliage was a vibrant green, some with silvery tones that shone in the sunlight, others with reddish and golden leaves that created a mosaic of colors. The fruits that hung from these trees were abundant and varied, some round and golden like small suns, others elongated with a deep purple. There were those that shone like red jewels, and those that had textured peels in shades of orange and yellow. The aroma they exuded was sweet and inviting, a symphony of fragrances that perfumed the entire garden. The ground was covered with soft grass, interspersed with wild flowers of colors impossible to adequately describe, blues more intense than the sky, reds more vivid than fire, yellows that seemed to capture the sunlight itself, and whites of absolute purity. Giant lilies grew near small, delicate flowers, creating a perfect harmony between the grand and the delicate. A river flowed from Eden, its crystal clear, pure waters reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. The water ran with a melodious sound over smooth, colorful stones, some white as milk, others translucent as crystal, and some with golden veins that shimmered in the light. This main river divided into 4 branches, each following a different direction, bringing life and fertility throughout that blessed land. The first river was the Pishon, which encircled the entire land of Avila, a region rich in pure gold, bdellium, and onyx stone. The second was the Gin, which surrounded the entire land of Cush. The third, the Tigris, flowed east of Assyria. And the fourth was the Euphrates, all of them carrying the life-giving waters of Eden to water the earth. In the center of this paradisiacal garden, God placed 2 special trees, distinct from all others. The tree of life stood majestically, with a silvery trunk and leaves that seemed to emanate a soft light. Its fruits had a peculiar glow, as if they contained within themselves the very essence of eternity. Near it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, equally beautiful, but with a presence that inspired not only admiration, but also reverence and caution. Its fruits were perfect in form and color, but carried a weight that went beyond their physical appearance. God took the man he had formed and placed him in the Garden of Eden. He did not place him there for a life of pure idleness, but to cultivate and guard it. Adam was given the purpose of working the land, of caring for that paradise, of being a faithful steward of God's creation. Work, in that state of perfection, was neither tiring nor oppressive, but a source of satisfaction and fulfillment. Adam walked through the garden, discovering every corner, every tree, every flower. The mornings were fresh and radiant, with a delicate dew covering the vegetation like thousands of tiny diamonds. The sun rose, tinging the sky with shades of pink, gold, and orange, its light gently warming without ever burning or bothering. The days were perfect in temperature, with a gentle breeze that made the leaves dance and brought the most diverse aromas. The animals were not afraid of Adam, nor he of them. Lions gently walked beside him, their golden manes swaying in the wind. Deer approached confidently, their large, sweet eyes reflecting pure innocence. Birds with colorful plumage perched on his shoulders, singing melodies that filled the air with music. Butterflies with iridescent wings danced around him. Even the bears and wolves, who would later be feared, at that time moved with gentleness, living in perfect harmony with all other creatures. God established only one rule, a single restriction in that paradise of infinite abundance. Calling Adam to his presence, the Lord spoke with clarity and solemnity. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, for they are all good and were created for your sustenance and pleasure. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. The instruction was clear, the warning was specific. Among thousands of trees laden with delicious fruit, only one was forbidden. It was not a tyrannical restriction, but an opportunity for Adam to exercise his freedom of choice, to demonstrate his obedience and trust in the Creator. That single tree represented the limit established by divine love, not to deprive man, but to protect him from knowledge for which he was not prepared. God, in his infinite wisdom, observed Adam in his activities in the garden. The man named the animals that God brought to him, exercising his dominion and authority over creation. Each creature received a name that reflected its nature: the lion for its majesty, the eagle for its keen vision, the lamb for its meekness. It was a grand task, and Adam performed it with diligence and intelligence. But while naming the animals, Adam noticed something. Each creature had its companion. The lions walked in pairs, the eagles had their partners, even the small birds sang in duet. There was a complementarity, a companionship among the animals, something that Adam did not experience. He was unique of his kind, alone amidst abundance. Then God declared, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a suitable helper for him." The Lord would not merely create another creature to keep Adam company, but someone who was truly compatible with him, who complemented him, who was equal in essence, but unique in his expression. God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, not an ordinary sleep, but divine torpor. While Adam slept under the shade of a great tree, with a gentle breeze caressing his face, God performed the first surgical act in history. With divine precision, he opened Adam's side and took one of his ribs, that bone near the heart, that part that was beside him, neither above to dominate nor below to be dominated, but beside him to be equal, to be a partner. From Adam's rib, God formed the woman. She was not created from the dust of the earth like Adam, but from the very substance of man, making her unique, part of him, and at the same time distinct. God shaped her with the same infinite care, creating her also in his image and likeness, endowed with beauty, intelligence, will, and spirit. When Adam woke up from that deep sleep, the first thing his eyes saw was her. And at that moment, something extraordinary happened in his heart. He had seen all of creation, had named all the animals, had contemplated all the wonders of the garden, but he had never seen anything like this. His eyes lit up, his heart raced, and from his lips came the first words of admiration and recognition uttered by one human being before another. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," exclaimed Adam, his voice filled with joy and recognition. He instantly understood that she was different from everything else in creation. She was not just another creature, but part of himself, the missing complement. "She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." She was named Eve, which means life or living one, for she would be the mother of all living beings, the source from which all future humanity would proceed. There they were, the first human couple, Adam and Eve, perfect in their creation, pure in their innocence. They were both naked in the garden, without any clothing, but they felt no shame. Their innocence was complete. There was no malice in their thoughts, no sin in their hearts. Their nakedness was natural and pure, an expression of total transparency with each other and with God. There was nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of, for sin had not yet entered the world. The days in Eden passed in perfect harmony. Adam and Eve walked together along the garden's paths, discovering its wonders together. In the morning, when the dew still covered the leaves, they gathered fresh fruit for their food. The fruits were abundant and varied, each with its own unique flavor, sweeter and more satisfying than any food that would later exist on fallen earth. They worked together, cultivating the garden, caring for the plants, keeping everything in order. Eve learned from Adam the names of the animals and plants. They talked, laughed, and contemplated together the beauty of creation. There were no conflicts between them, no misunderstandings, no harsh words. Everything was perfect communion, absolute harmony. The afternoons were especially precious, for it was when God walked through the garden in the cool of the day. Adam and Eve heard the Lord's voice and ran to meet him. They spoke with God face to face, without fear, without barriers. The Creator spoke with his creatures, teaching them about creation, about his purposes, about life. That direct communion with the divine was the greatest privilege and joy they experienced. The nights were serene, with the starry sky shining in all its splendor. Adam and Eve lay under the trees, contemplating the stars, marveling at the immensity of creation. There was no fear of darkness, no lurking dangers. Everything was peace, everything was security, everything was perfect. In the center of the garden, the two special trees remained as constant reminders. The tree of life, with its fruits that conferred immortality, was available to them. But the tree of the knowledge of good and evil remained untouched, respected, obeying the only prohibition that God had established. Among all the animals of the field that the Lord God had made, there was none more cunning than the serpent. She was different from the serpents that would exist after the fall, probably with the ability to move upright, perhaps even with limbs, certainly more beautiful and impressive in appearance. But behind that creature, an evil intelligence operated, a fallen being that had rebelled against God in heaven and now sought to corrupt divine creation on earth. The serpent had observed Adam and Eve for some time. She knew the divine prohibition. She knew of the tree that was forbidden to them. And on a fateful day, when Eve was walking alone near the center of the garden, the serpent saw her opportunity and approached her. Light filtered through the leaves of the trees, creating dancing patterns on the ground. Birds sang in the distance, and the aroma of flowers perfumed the air. Everything seemed perfect and safe. Eve appreciated the beauty of the garden, perhaps picking some flowers, when she heard a voice she had never heard before, a voice that questioned her. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? The question was laden with innuendo, with doubt subtly planted. The serpent did not directly deny God's word, but began by questioning it, distorting it. It suggested that God had been restrictive, that he had forbidden all trees, when in fact only one was forbidden. Eve, in her innocence, but perhaps already with a curiosity piqued, answered the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, 'You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.'" Eve's response already contained a slight deviation. God had not said not to touch the tree, only not to eat its fruit. There was already a subtle distortion of the divine word, an addition that perhaps indicated that Eve was beginning to see God's prohibition as something more restrictive than it actually was. The serpent, perceiving the opening, became bolder. Its voice was soft, persuasive, full of false wisdom. "You will certainly not die," it said, directly contradicting God's word. "For God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The lie was launched, wrapped in half-truths that made it even more deceptive. The serpent planted in Eve the seed of distrust in God. It insinuated that God was hiding something good from them, that he was being selfish, that he did not want them to reach their full potential. The temptation wasn't just about eating a fruit, but about questioning God's goodness, about desiring to be like God, about choosing one's own path instead of trusting the Creator. Eve stood there before the forbidden tree. The conversation with the serpent had planted something new in her heart: doubt, curiosity, desire. For the first time, she looked at that tree not with respect for the divine prohibition, but with covetousness. The fruits hung from the branches, perfectly formed, with vibrant colors that seemed to call to her. Eve contemplated them and saw that the tree was good to eat. The fruits looked succulent, appetizing, even better than the fruits of the thousands of other trees she could freely eat from. It was pleasing to the eye. There was a beauty in them that seduced, that attracted the gaze, and did not let it look away. But there was more. Eve realized that that tree was desirable for giving understanding. The serpent's promise echoed in her mind: "You will be like God, knowing good and evil." What knowledge would that be? What wisdom was hidden in that fruit? The desire to know, to be more than she was, to transcend her condition, grew within her. At that crucial moment, Eve had a choice to make. She could have run away, called for Adam, sought God in prayer, resisted temptation. But instead, she reached out. Her fingers touched the forbidden fruit, feeling its smooth, firm texture. There was no lightning bolt that struck from the sky, no thundering voice forbidding her. Encouraged by this, she picked the fruit. For a moment, Eve held the fruit in her hands, looking at it. Would this really be the last moment of her innocence? But the decision had already been made. She brought the fruit to her mouth and bit into it. The taste was sweet, perhaps the sweetest she had ever tasted, but it was a bitter taste of disobedience. And then, she didn't keep it to herself. Eve walked over to where Adam was, perhaps working somewhere in the garden, and offered him the fruit. We don't know the exact word she used, but Adam was with her, and he was fully aware of the divine prohibition. He wasn't deceived like Eve, but consciously chose to disobey. Adam took the fruit from Eve's hands and ate it. At that moment, something fundamental changed in the universe. Sin, which until then did not exist on earth, entered the world. Perfect harmony was broken. Communion with God was severed. Innocence was lost. Immediately, the consequences began to manifest. The serpent had told a half-truth. Their eyes were opened, but not to the divine wisdom they expected. Instead, their eyes were open to their own nakedness, to their vulnerability, to their shame. For the first time, Adam and Eve looked at each other and felt something they had never experienced before: embarrassment. Where before there had only been innocence and purity, now there was awareness of exposure. Where before there had been total transparency, now there was the desire to hide. They looked around, searching for something, anything, to cover themselves. They found a fig tree with broad leaves and hastily sewed fig leaves together to make coverings to cover their nakedness. But the fig leaves were an inadequate solution. They were uncomfortable, itched their skin, and began to wilt almost immediately. More than that, they couldn't cover what really needed to be covered: the shame, the guilt, the sin that now dwelt in their hearts. The garden, which moments before had seemed welcoming, now looked different to them. The shadows seemed darker, the sounds more menacing. They had changed, and although the garden remained the same, their perception of it had been fundamentally altered. Evening was falling over Eden. It was the time when God normally came to walk through the garden in the cool of the day, the time Adam and Eve most looked forward to, when they could talk to their Creator face to face. But that day, everything was different. They heard the voice of the Lord God, the sound of His footsteps that had once filled them with joy. But instead of running to meet Him as they always did, Adam and Eve felt something new and terrible: fear. For the first time, they feared God's presence. For the first time, they wanted to hide from Him. They ran among the trees of the garden, looking for a place to hide. They hid among the dense foliage, crouching behind thick trunks, hoping that God would not find them. But how can one hide from the omnipresent God? How can one hide anything from the omniscient God? God's voice echoed through the garden, not angry but laden with sorrow. "Adam, where are you?" It was not a question asked out of ignorance. God knew exactly where Adam was, what he had done. It was a question to make Adam confront his new condition, to initiate a dialogue about what had happened. From behind the trees, with a trembling voice, Adam answered, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." The words were laden with fear, shame, and guilt. Adam had changed. The man who once walked freely in the presence of God now hid from him. God asked another penetrating question. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? The question went straight to the point. God was giving Adam the opportunity to confess, to take responsibility. But Adam, instead of humbly confessing, tried to deflect the blame. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from a tree, and I ate. It was an answer that blamed not only Eve, but indirectly God himself for having created woman. Sin was already bearing its fruits: broken relationships, accusations, refusal to take responsibility. God then turned to Eve. What is this that you have done? Another opportunity for confession, for genuine repentance. But Eve also deflected the blame. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. It was true that the serpent had deceived her, but that did not exempt her from her own choice, from her own responsibility. What followed was one of the most solemn and sad moments in all of human history. God, with perfect justice, but also with profound sadness, declared the consequences of sin. First, God turned to the serpent. His voice was severe, laden with judgment. Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. The serpent, which perhaps had previously walked upright, would now be reduced to crawling in the dust. But there was more to the curse, something prophetic and hopeful amidst the judgment. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. It was the first promise of redemption, the first announcement that someone would come from the woman's seed who would crush the serpent's head, who would undo the damage caused by that terrible day. It was a ray of hope in the midst of judgment, the promise of a future Savior. Then God turned to Eve. His voice, though firm, carried sadness. I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Motherhood, which should have been a pure blessing, would now be marked by pain. And there was more. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. The perfect relationship between man and woman would be marked by conflict, by power struggles, by pain. Finally, God addressed Adam. The words were heavy, laden with consequences that would forever change the human experience on earth. Because you listened to the voice of your wife and ate from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The earth, which had previously produced abundantly without effort, would now be cursed. Thorns and thistles would grow. Work, which had once been a source of satisfaction, would become arduous and tiring. And death, which was not part of the original plan, was now a certainty. Adam, formed from dust, would return to dust. God's words echoed through the garden, and the silence that followed was heavy with sadness. Paradise was stained. Innocence was lost. Sin had entered the world, and with it, all its terrible consequences. But even in the midst of judgment, there was mercy. God did not destroy them immediately, as perhaps they deserved. In the curse upon the serpent, there was a promise of future redemption. And what God did next demonstrated that, although justice demanded consequences, his love had not abandoned his fallen creatures. The fig leaves that Adam and Eve had sown together were inadequate, already withered and falling apart. They could not truly cover their shame. They could not solve the problem of sin. Something more was needed, a real sacrifice. God, in his mercy, provided garments of skin for Adam and Eve. To obtain skins, an animal had to die. There, for the first time in history, innocent blood was shed. An animal, without guilt, without sin, died so that man could be covered. It was an image, a shadow of the future sacrifice to come, when the Lamb of God would shed his blood to cover not only physical nakedness, but the sin of humanity. God, with his own hands, clothed Adam and Eve with those skins. It was an act of tenderness, of paternal care, even amidst the consequences of sin. He did not abandon them in their shame, but provided adequate covering for them. But God knew that it would not be safe for Adam and Eve to remain in the garden. They had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the center of the garden was still the tree of life, with its fruit that conferred immortality. If now, in their fallen state, they were to eat from the tree of life, they would live forever in sin, without the possibility of redemption, in a state of eternal misery. Then God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand, and take also from the tree of life, and eat, and live forever." It was necessary that they be removed from the garden, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy, so that they would not be permanently fixed in their fallen state. The sentence was pronounced. Adam and Eve had to leave Eden, the only home they knew, the perfect paradise where they had lived in communion with God, would no longer be their dwelling place. They had to go out to cultivate the land from which Adam had been taken, land now marked by the curse, which would produce thorns and thistles. God cast Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. They walked for the last time along those paths they knew so well, past the fruit trees, the crystal clear river, the fragrant flowers. Each step was heavy, laden with regret and loss. They looked back, seeing the garden that would never be theirs again. At the entrance to the garden on the eastern side, God placed cherubim, powerful and majestic angelic beings, with a flaming sword that gleamed and moved in all directions. The flaming sword constantly spun, an insurmountable barrier, guarding the path to the tree of life. Paradise was now closed to fallen humanity. Adam and Eve left Eden and entered a different world. The land outside did not have the perfection of the garden. It was rougher, wilder. They would have to work hard to cultivate it. They would know fatigue, pain, the struggle for survival. But they carried with them God's promise concerning the seed of the woman who would one day crush the serpent's head. Thus ended the time of humanity's innocence. Paradise was lost, but not hope. Although Adam and Eve had failed, although sin had entered the world, God had already planted the promise of redemption. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is the story of God's perfect creation, of the dignity conferred upon humanity by being made in the divine image, of the precious gift of freedom of choice. It is also the tragic story of how that freedom was misused, how trust was broken, how sin entered the world. But it is also a story of mercy. God could have destroyed Adam and Eve immediately. He could have left them without hope. Instead, he made them clothes, promised a future Redeemer, and although he expelled them from paradise, he did not abandon them. Humanity, descended from that first couple, would bear the consequences of that fateful choice. We would know pain, suffering, hard work, death. But we would also know the promise of redemption, the announcement that one day someone would come who would undo the damage done that day in Eden. Before the gates of the garden, guarded by cherubim and a flaming sword, Adam and Eve began their new journey. They had lost paradise, but they also gained something: the knowledge of good and evil, a deeper understanding of the consequences of their choices, and hope in God's promise of a future Redeemer. And so the history of humanity began not in the preserved paradise, but in the lost paradise, and the hope of a paradise to be restored. The story of David and Goliath. More than 3,000 years ago, in the arid and stony hills of the ancient land of Judah, where the scorching sun burned the red earth, and the wind carried the scent of juniper and terebinth, one of the most extraordinary episodes in human history unfolded. This is the narrative of how the faith of a young shepherd transformed the destiny of an entire nation. In the days when Saul reigned over Israel, when the tribes were still fighting to consolidate their presence in that land promised by God to their ancestors, a menacing shadow rose on the horizon. The Philistines, a warrior people from the shores of the Great Sea, gathered their forces in a show of power that would make even the bravest tremble. The Philistine army set up camp at Soko, a strategic region in the lowlands of Judah, where deep valleys cut through the mountains like scars on the earth. On the opposite side of the valley of Elah, separated by a steep, rocky gorge, the army of Israel pitched its tents on the stony slopes. Between the two camps ran a small stream of crystal-clear water, winding between smooth stones polished by time. The tension in the air was palpable. In the Israelite tents, soldiers sharpened their spears while the metallic sound echoed between the hills. Fires crackled in the night, illuminating faces marked by apprehension. The smell of baked bread and lamb mingled with the acrid odor of sweat and leather armor. Sentinels watched over the dark valley, where occasionally enemy fires blazed on the other side. Among the Philistines was a man whose name would soon become synonymous with terror for the Israelites, Goliath of Gath. This warrior was like a mountain of flesh and muscle, rising to almost 3 meters in height. His skin, tanned by countless sun-baked military campaigns, was marked with scars that told stories of past battles. His arms were as thick as cedar trunks, and his enormous hands could crush a man's head as if it were a ripe fruit. Goliath's armor was a masterpiece of Philistine metallurgy. His bronze helmet gleamed in the sun like polished gold, decorated with reliefs depicting dragons and serpents. The breastplate covering his chest and back weighed over 50 kilograms, composed of overlapping bronze scales that tinkled with every movement like a sinister drum announcing death. His legs were protected by bronze greaves, and between his shoulders he carried a shield so large that it required a shield bearer just to carry it. But Goliath's most fearsome weapon was his spear. The shaft was as thick as a loom's axle, made of fire-hardened oak wood. The iron point weighed about 7 kilograms and was as sharp as a razor, capable of piercing armor and shields with frightening ease. When Goliath marched, the ground seemed to tremble beneath his feet. Every morning, as the sun rose behind the mountains of Judea, tinging the sky with shades of orange and purple, Goliath emerged from a Philistine camp like a vision from nightmares. His shield-bearer walked ahead, carrying the immense shield that cast a dark shadow on the ground. The giant's armor reflected the morning light, creating blinding flashes that made the Israelite soldiers look away. With a thundering voice that echoed across the rocky slopes of the valley, Goliath issued his challenge. "Why have you all come out, forming yourselves in battle formation? Am I not a Philistine and you servants of Saul? Choose a man from among you to come down against me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." His mocking laughter rolled through the valley like thunder. "Today I defy the troops of Israel. Send me a man, so that we may fight together." At nightfall, when the long shadows stretched across the hills and the sky was tinged blood-red, Goliath repeated his challenge. And each time, the same heavy silence fell over the Israelite camp like a suffocating cloak. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became more than a month. For 40 days and 40 nights, morning and evening, Goliath continued his intimidation. And for 40 days, not a single Israelite soldier dared to accept the challenge. In the tents of Israel, strong and experienced men bowed their heads in shame. Some murmured desperate prayers. Others nervously sharpened their swords, but no one took a step forward. Even Saul, the king of Israel, a man who stood out above all other Israelites for his height and military experience, remained in his royal tent, consumed by indecision and fear. The army's morale plummeted each day. What had begun as a show of force was turning into a public humiliation. The soldiers began to question, where was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Where was the God who had parted the Red Sea and brought down the walls of Jericho? About 20 kilometers south of the valley of Elah, in the rolling hills of Bethlehem, life continued at its pastoral and tranquil pace. Fields of golden barley swayed in the wind, centuries-old olive trees provided generous shade, and vineyards stretched across the fertile slopes. It was a land of bucolic beauty, where shepherds led their flocks through the verdant pastures and the sound of their flutes echoed at dusk. In this land lived a man named Jesse, a respected elder of Bethlehem and father of 8 sons. His 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had left to serve in Saul's army, leaving a void in their father's house. But the youngest son remained at home, tending the family flocks. This young man was named David, and he was far from being a child. At about 15 or 16 years old, he already had the defined muscles of someone who spent entire days under the sun, herding sheep across the rugged terrain of the region. His youthful face had the tanned skin of a shepherd, and his brown eyes shone with a lively and penetrating intelligence. His red hair, uncommon among his people, was kept short so as not to hinder his work. David knew every stone, every cave, every water source in the vicinity of Bethlehem. He spent entire days alone with the sheep, watching the clouds that passed like white ships in the infinite blue sky, feeling the wind whisper among the ancient rocks. In those moments of solitude, he composed songs to the Lord, playing melodies on his rudimentary harp made of sycamore wood. But the life of a shepherd was not made only of poetic contemplation. David knew the danger that lurked in the wild places. He had faced predators that descended from the mountains in search of easy prey. More than once, lions from the rocky hills tried to attack his flock with their dark manes and roars that made the earth tremble. Enormous bears, coming from the northern forests in search of food, also represented a constant threat. But David had learned not to fear. With his sling of tan leather and well-chosen stones, he practiced daily, hitting targets 50 meters away with deadly precision. And when the sling was not enough, when the predator was already on his sheep, David wielded his oak staff, as tall as he was, hardened by fire and perfectly balanced, and fought hand to hand. There was a day when a lion, desperate with hunger, pounced on a young sheep. David did not hesitate. He ran to the beast, grabbed its mane with superhuman strength, and while the lion roared with fury, struck it repeatedly with his staff until the beast fell lifeless. On another occasion, a gigantic bear tried to drag away a lamb. David pursued the animal, snatched the lamb from its jaws, and killed the bear with his own hands. These experiences shaped the young shepherd. He knew he was not fighting alone. Each time he faced danger, he felt a presence beside him, the presence of the God of Israel, who watched over both the sheep and the shepherd. More than a month had passed since the armies positioned themselves in the valley of Elah. In Bethlehem, Jesse was worried about his older sons. There had been no news from the front for weeks, and the elder feared for the well-being of Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. On a clear morning, when the dew still covered the grass like tiny diamonds and the fresh dawn air carried the scent of wildflowers, Jesse called David. "My son," said the old man, his voice heavy with concern, "take now for your brothers an ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread, and run to the camp. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of 1,000. See how your brothers are doing, and bring me news of them." David respectfully nodded. He entrusted the sheep to the care of another shepherd, gathered the provisions in a bag of coarse cloth, and set out at daybreak. The journey to the valley of Elah would take several hours of brisk walking along winding trails that cut through the hills. The road was beautiful, even in the gloomy circumstances. David passed terraced vineyards where workers were already beginning to prune the vines. He crossed groves of terebinth trees whose dark green leaves provided refreshing shade. He climbed and descended rolling hills, from where he could see the mountains of Judea rising majestically against the sky in the distance. As he approached the valley of Elah, the landscape changed. The cultivated hills gave way to rougher, rockier terrain. The distant sound of male voices and the smell of campfire smoke announced the proximity of the camp. When he finally arrived at the tents of Israel, the sun was already high in the sky. The camp was a temporary city of brown and white tarpaulins stretching across the mountainside. Thousands of men moved between the tents, some sharpening weapons, others preparing meals, some resting in the shade, chatting in small groups. David left the provisions with the storekeeper and ran to find his brothers. When he located them, he embraced them warmly, but noticed the mark of prolonged tension on their faces. Eliab, normally so confident, had deep dark circles under his eyes. Abinadab kept his hand constantly on his sword, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Shammah looked nervously toward the valley. David was about to ask about the situation when a trumpet blast ripped through the air. Immediately, the entire camp sprang into frantic motion. Soldiers rushed to their positions, grabbed their shields and spears, and formed orderly ranks. "What's happening?" David asked, adrenaline already coursing through his veins. "It's him," Eliab replied in a somber voice. "The giant. He comes twice a day to challenge us." David followed his brothers to the front line. He positioned himself among the soldiers and looked at the valley for the first time. What he saw made his heart race, but not with fear. On the opposite side of the valley, emerging from a Philistine camp like a moving mountain, came Goliath. Even from a distance, his figure was terrifying. The morning sun reflected off his bronze armor, creating an almost supernatural aura around the giant. His shield-bearer walked ahead, bent under the weight of the immense shield. The valley fell into absolute silence. Even the birds stopped singing. The wind ceased, as if nature itself held its breath. Goliath stopped in the middle of the valley, his legs planted firmly on the ground like two columns. His thundering voice filled the space. "Why have you come out, forming yourselves in battle formation? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man from among you to come down against me." David looked around and saw something that deeply shocked him. Experienced warriors, soldiers who had fought in dozens of battles, recoiled at the Philistines' words. Some trembled visibly. Others looked away, unable to face the sight of the giant. "If he can fight with me and wound me," Goliath continued, his laughter echoing through the hills, "we will be your servants. But if I prevail and wound him, you will be our servants and serve us." The giant struck his spear against the shield, producing a metallic clang that reverberated like a war bell. "Today I defy the troops of Israel. Send me a man, so that we may fight together." Silence. A heavy, shameful, suffocating silence. David felt something burning in his chest. It wasn't just indignation, it was a righteous, holy fury. How could this uncircumcised man, this pagan who didn't know the living God, dare to defy the armies of the Lord? How could those men, servants of the Most High, back down before a mere mortal, however great he might be? He turned to the soldiers around him and asked, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes the reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The soldiers, surprised by the young man's audacity, explained that King Saul had promised great riches to whoever defeated Goliath. Furthermore, the victor would receive the hand of the king's daughter in marriage, and his family would be exempt from taxes and mandatory services in Israel. But despite these tempting rewards, no one moved. Eliab, David's older brother, heard his questions and became furious. He approached the young man, his face red with anger. "Why did you come down here?" Eliab rebuked sharply. "And to whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know your arrogance and the wickedness of your heart. You came down only to see the battle." David calmly replied, undeterred, "What have I done now? Wasn't it just a question?" And he continued asking the other soldiers about Goliath's challenge. His insistence and courageous words began to attract attention. Soldiers who heard the young shepherd speaking fearlessly took his words to their commanders. The commanders took them to the king. And so, the words of a young shepherd reached the ears of Saul, king of Israel. Saul's royal tent was the largest in the camp, made of finely woven fabrics in shades of purple and crimson. Inside, Persian carpets covered the floor, and oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls. The air was heavy with the scent of frankincense. When David was led into the king's presence, he found a man consumed by worry. Saul sat in an ornate chair, but his posture was anything but regal. Stooped, his head resting on his hands, the king seemed to have aged years in the last few weeks. Around him, his advisers and generals conversed in low, somber tones. David bowed before the king, but when he raised his face, his eyes shone with a confidence that had not been seen in that tent for a long time. "Let no one's heart fail because of him," David said, his voice young but firm. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." A murmur of surprise swept through the tent. The generals exchanged incredulous glances. Saul raised his head and truly looked at David for the first time. He saw a young man of perhaps 16 years old, of medium build, without armor, without visible military training. "You cannot go against this Philistine to fight with him," said Saul, his voice a mixture of compassion and disbelief. "You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David did not back down. He took another step forward and began to speak, his voice gaining strength. "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a sheep from a flock, I went out after it, struck it down, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I seized it by its mane, struck it down, and killed it." The men in the tent leaned forward, fascinated. "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear," David continued, his eyes now burning with inner fire. "This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And then David uttered the words that would change everything. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." There was a long silence in the tent. Something in the young man's voice, in the absolute certainty of his words, touched something deep in Saul. The king remembered when he himself was young, when he trusted in the Lord without questioning, when faith was simple and pure. Saul rose from his chair and walked over to David. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Immediately, the king's servants ran to bring the royal armor itself. They dressed David with Saul's bronze helmet, covered him with the armor of metal scales, and girded him with the king's sword. But when David tried to take a step, he almost fell. The armor was too heavy, restrictive, uncomfortable. He had never worn armor before, never trained with war equipment. He tried to walk a few more steps, but it was clear that it wouldn't work. "I can't walk with this," David said honestly, "because I've never tried it on." And then, before the king and all his generals, David began to remove the armor. Piece by piece, he dropped the bronze and iron to the ground, until he was once again dressed only in his simple shepherd's clothes, a brown wool tunic, a leather belt, worn sandals. Some of the generals laughed nervously, thinking that the young man had changed his mind. But David wasn't finished. He picked up his shepherd's staff, the wood polished by years of use, as familiar in his hands as his own fingers. He fastened his leather sling to his waist, and then he left the royal tent and headed toward the valley. He made only one stop before descending to meet the giant. At the bottom of the valley, where the small stream meandered between the rocks, David stopped. The crystal-clear water murmured softly, creating an almost unreal contrast with the deadly tension that hung in the air. Thousands of eyes were watching him now, from both sides of the valley. In the Israelite camp, soldiers huddled on the edges of the slope, unable to believe what they were seeing. On the Philistine side, warriors gathered to watch the spectacle of what appeared to be a suicide. David knelt by the stream. The cold water flowed over his hands as he plunged them in, feeling the stones in the riverbed. He hadn't chosen stones at random. Years of practice with a sling had taught him exactly what to look for: smooth stones, perfectly rounded by the water, the ideal size to fit in the sling, heavy enough to provide momentum, but not so heavy that they would lose speed. One by one, he chose 5 perfect stones. He placed them in a shepherd's bag that hung from his waist. Why 5? Perhaps he knew that Goliath had 4 giant brothers, also feared warriors. Or perhaps he simply wanted to be prepared. But in truth, he would only need 1. When he stood up, he took a deep breath. The air smelled of dust and the sweat of thousands of men. He could hear his own heart beating. But there was no fear in him, only a supernatural calm, an absolute certainty that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. He began to climb the slope toward Goliath. Goliath had observed the commotion in the Israelite camp with interest. Finally, after 40 days, someone had accepted his challenge. The giant prepared for battle with anticipation, imagining the glory of crushing yet another Israelite warrior. But when he saw who was climbing the slope toward him, Goliath couldn't believe his eyes. It was a young man, a simple young man, without armor, holding only a shepherd's staff. He looked more like a child than a warrior. His face was rosy and beardless, his red hair shone in the sun, his clothes were those of a peasant. Goliath's fury erupted like a volcano. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" roared the giant, his voice trembling with offended indignation. Goliath cursed David by his gods, Dagon, Baal-zebub, Astarte, invoking all the powers of darkness upon the young man. "Come to me," Goliath mocked, his voice dripping with disdain, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." The giant laughed now, a cruel and mocking laugh that echoed through the valley. From the Philistine camp came shouts of approval and jeers directed at the young shepherd. But David continued walking, his steps firm and determined. When he was close enough, he stopped and raised his voice. And when he spoke, his words cut through the air like a sharp sword. "You come against me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The entire valley fell silent. Even the winds seemed to stop to listen. "This very day," David continued, his voice young but laden with prophetic authority, "the the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. Then the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." And then David proclaimed the truth that sustained his courage. "All this assembly will know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Goliath growled with rage and began to advance, each step making the earth tremble. His squire ran ahead of him, the enormous shield raised to protect his master. But David didn't wait. Seeing the giant advance, he ran to meet him. As he ran, his hand plunged into his shepherd's bag and pulled out one of the smooth stones. In a movement practiced 1,000 times in the fields of Bethlehem, he placed the stone in his sling. The sling began to spin above his head, faster and faster, creating a sharp whistling sound in the air. Goliath raised his spear, preparing to throw. But David was faster. With a precision born of years protecting sheep from predators, with strength augmented by absolute faith in the God of Israel, David released the stone. The stone flew through the air, invisible by its speed, cutting the space between the young man and the giant like an arrow launched by the very arm of God. Goliath saw blur. He had no time to dodge. He had no time to raise his shield. The stone struck the giant right in the middle of his forehead, the only vulnerable point between his helmet and face shield. The sound of the impact echoed through the valley like the crack of a whip. The stone sank into Goliath's skull with tremendous force. The giant stopped. For an endless moment, he stood still, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief. His spear fell from his numb hands. His legs began to wobble. And then, like a crumbling stone tower, like a centuries-old oak falling in the forest, Goliath collapsed. He fell face down on the ground, raising a cloud of dust. The impact of his body made the ground tremble. The silence that followed was absolute, total, deafening. David ran to the fallen body of the giant. Goliath was still breathing, but he was unconscious, completely incapacitated. David had no sword of his own, so he took the giant's enormous sword. With both hands, he unsheathed the huge blade. It was so heavy that any normal man would have difficulty lifting it, but David felt supernatural strength flow through his arms. He raised the sword above his head, and with a powerful blow, cut off Goliath's head. The roar that rose from the camp of Israel shook the mountains. Thousands of voices shouted in ecstasy, in liberation, in triumph. 40 days of shame were erased in an instant. Fear was replaced by fierce courage. On the opposite side of the valley, the Philistines watched in horror. Their champion, their invincible giant, lay dead on the ground, beheaded by a young shepherd. When they saw the army of Israel begin to descend the valley, roaring war cries, panic gripped them. The Philistines broke formation and fled. They abandoned their tents, their weapons, their provisions. They ran back to their coastal cities, closely pursued by the army of Israel, which now fought with renewed courage. The victory was complete and overwhelming. The soldiers of Israel pursued the Philistines to the gates of Gath and Ekron, leaving a trail of defeated enemies in their wake. The valleys and hills echoed with cries of victory. When the army of Israel returned, they plundered the abandoned Philistine camp, collecting riches and weapons. But David took only Goliath's head, a trophy he would later take to Jerusalem, and the giant's armor, which he would keep as a memorial of the day God worked a miracle through a young shepherd. On that day, in the dusty hills and rocky valleys of the ancient land of Judah, more than a battle was won. An eternal truth was etched into the history of mankind, the truth that God's power does not depend on human strength, physical height, bronze armor, or iron spear. David returned to the camps of Israel no longer as a simple shepherd, but as a celebrated hero, a liberator of his people. The women of Israel would come out of the cities to greet him with songs and dances, playing tambourines and harps. His life would never be the same again. But the true meaning of that day transcended David or Goliath. What happened in the valley of Elah was a demonstration of God's character, a God who chooses the weak of the world to confound the strong, who uses the despised to shame the powerful, who works through those who trust him completely, regardless of circumstances, odds, or human logic. The story of David and Goliath resonates through the centuries because it speaks to something deep in the human heart. We all face giants in our lives, obstacles that seem insurmountable, challenges that make us feel small and inadequate, voices that mock our faith and tell us we have no chance. But the lesson of the Valley of Elah remains: when you are on God's side, when your trust is in the Lord of hosts and not in your own strength, no giant is too big. No challenge is insurmountable. No battle is lost before it begins. For, as David proclaimed on that memorable day, the battle is the Lord's. And 3,000 years later, those words still echo, bringing hope to those who face their own giants, reminding us that victory does not belong to the strong, the great, or the well-armed, but to those who trust in the living God. The story ends where it began, in the hills of Judah, where a young shepherd briefly returned to his flock before being called to the destiny God had prepared for him. But the smooth stones of the Elah Brook remain, silent monuments to a day when faith moved mountains and a young man changed the course of history. And the message remains for all who have ears to hear: not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Abraham and God's promise. Thousands of years ago, when the world was still young and ancient civilizations erected their towers under starry skies, a story began to be written. A story that would span generations, cross deserts and oceans, and reach us today. It is the story of a man named Abraham and the promise God made to him. A promise that would change not only his life, but the destiny of all humanity. This is a journey of faith, obedience, doubt, and miracles. It is the story of how an ordinary man became the father of nations, and how God fulfills his promises, even when everything seems impossible. Prepare your heart to immerse yourself in this ancient, yet eternally relevant narrative. Close your eyes if you wish, and let the words transport you to those distant days, to those arid lands, to that encounter that changed everything. Our story begins in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most prosperous and ancient cities of Mesopotamia. Imagine a metropolis surrounded by thick walls of sun-baked bricks, with immense gates guarded day and night. Its narrow, winding streets were lined with adobe houses some 2 stories high, with flat roofs where families gathered at dusk to escape the stifling heat of the day. In the center of the city, dominating the landscape, stood the ziggurat, a step tower dedicated to the moon god Nana. It was an imposing structure with steps that seemed to reach the heavens, painted in vibrant colors that shimmered under the scorching sun. Around the temple, priests dressed in long robes performed daily rituals, burning incense whose aroma spread through the streets, mingling with the smell of bread baking in ovens, animals in corrals, and the Euphrates River that meandered near the city. It was there, in that center of commerce and idolatry, that a man named Abram lived. He was no different from the other inhabitants of Ur. Raised amidst local customs, surrounded by temples of idols, and the constant presence of the polytheistic religion that dominated Chaldea. His father, Terah, was a respected man, and the family had an established life, with property, servants, and a defined social position. Abraham walked the same streets every day. He saw merchants trading fabrics from India, spices from Arabia, precious metals, and grains. He heard the constant noise of blacksmiths hammering bronze and copper, potters shaping vessels on their wheels, and women chatting as they filled their jars with water at the communal wells. Life in Ur was predictable, safe, comfortable, but something inside Abram was restless. The stone and wooden gods that surrounded the city did not speak to his heart. The empty promises of the priests did not bring peace to his soul. There was a void that not all the riches of Ur could fill. And then, in a moment that would change everything, the true God, the creator of heaven and earth, the one who does not dwell in temples made by human hands, spoke to Abram. We don't know exactly what that first encounter was like. The Bible doesn't detail whether it was an audible voice echoing in the quiet of the night, whether it was during the day, amidst his daily tasks, or whether it was a deep and unwavering conviction that settled in his heart. What we do know is that it was undeniable. It was transformative. It was divine. God said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Pause for a moment and consider the weight of those words. God was asking Abram to leave everything. His homeland with its familiar landscapes, its ancestral traditions, its places of memory. His relatives, the cousins, uncles, aunts, the entire network of relationships that provided security and identity in that tribal culture. And his father's house, the center of the family structure, the source of inheritance and protection. And where should he go? God didn't say. He only said that he would show him the way. It was a calling that demanded blind trust, absolute faith, obedience without tangible guarantees. But there were promises, grand promises. Abram would be the father of a great nation. His name would be magnified. He would be a source of blessing. And even more impressive, through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. This last promise pointed to something much greater than Abram could imagine at that moment, something that would reach millennia into the future. Abram was 75 years old when he received this calling. He was not a young adventurer seeking novelty, but a mature, established man with a life built. The decision he made was extraordinary. He believed. He simply believed. He trusted the voice of that God whom he did not fully know, but who spoke with an authority that no idol in UR had ever possessed. Imagine the preparation for that journey. Abram talking to his wife Sarai, explaining the inexplicable, sharing a promise that seemed impossible, especially since they were both elderly and had no children. Sarai, at 65 years old, hearing that her husband had received a call from God to leave everything and set off into the unknown. There were undoubtedly moments of doubt. Nights when Abram looked at the starry sky above UR and wondered if he had understood correctly. Days when the voice of pragmatism whispered that he was being foolish, that he was risking too much, that he should stay where it was safe. But faith prevailed. Abram began to organize the departure. He gathered his servants, both men and women, who would accompany him on this uncertain journey. He separated the flocks of sheep and goats, the cattle, the donkeys that would carry the tents and supplies. He packed the few possessions they could take, the valuables, the provisions of water and food for the desert crossing. His nephew Lot, son of his deceased brother, decided to accompany them. Terah, his father, also joined the caravan, although he would not reach the final destination, as he would die in the city of Haran, halfway there. And then, on a morning like any other, but different from all the others, the caravan set off. The wheels of the chariots creaked, the animals mooed and bleated, the children ran between the folded tents, and Abram gave one last look at the walls of UR. He was leaving civilization behind and walking towards a desert, guided only by a promise. The journey from UR to Canaan was neither short nor easy. The caravan had to follow the route of the trade caravans, a path that formed a fertile crescent, skirting the impassable Syrian desert. First, they traveled along the Euphrates River, where the land was still green and there was abundant water. Palm trees swayed in the wind, providing welcome shade during the day. At dusk, the caravan set up camp, spreading out their goatskin tents and lighting fires around which families gathered. At night, the desert transformed. The stifling heat of the day gave way to a penetrating cold. The sky filled with more stars than could be counted, scattered like diamonds on black velvet. Abram often left his tent and gazed at that immensity. There, under that cosmic canopy, he felt the presence of God, although he did not yet fully understand where he was being led. The caravan passed through small villages and towns. In Haran, they stopped for a while. Haran was an important commercial crossroads, a vibrant city where routes from Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, and Anatolia intersected. There, Terah died, and Abram remained until God spoke again, reiterating the call for him to continue on to Canaan. When they finally resumed their journey, the path became more arduous. They left behind the verdant riverbanks and entered drier regions. The sun beat down relentlessly on them. The sand penetrated everything, their clothes, their food, their eyes. Water had to be carefully rationed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. But Abram did not turn back. Each step was an act of renewed faith. Finally, after a long and exhausting journey, the caravan crossed the hills of Palestine and arrived in the land of Canaan. It was a different land from UR. It did not have the large walled cities, the imposing ziggurats, the bustling commerce. Canaan was a land of rolling hills covered with olive trees and vineyards, of fertile valleys and coastal plains. The land was inhabited by the Canaanites, a people who lived in independent city-states, each with its own king. They worshipped gods like Baal and Asherah, performed rituals that included abominable practices, and had a culture that bore no resemblance to what God desired for his people. Abram first arrived at Shechem, a city located in a valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. It was a place of great natural beauty, where there was an oak tree considered sacred by the local inhabitants. There, something extraordinary happened. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." Imagine the impact of those words. Abram had walked for months, left everything behind, followed a calling based solely on faith. And now, for the first time, God was specifically saying what the promised land was. This land, Canaan, would be given to his descendants. There was just one small problem. Abram had no descendants. He and Sarai were old and childless. But God was speaking of descendants in the plural, as if they were countless. In response to this revelation, Abram did something that would become his trademark throughout the journey. He built an altar to the Lord. He took stones from the site, carefully piled them up, and there offered sacrifice to the God who had called him and was now confirming his promise. That altar was more than a pile of stones. It was a testimony, a public declaration that Abram belonged to the true God. In a land full of altars to Baal and other false gods, he erected an altar to the Lord. After Shechem, Abram continued his journey through the land, moving south to the hill country between Bethel and Ai. There, he again built an altar to the Lord and called upon his name. Abram lived in Canaan as a foreigner. He had no permanent home, no land, and no citizenship in any of the city-states. He lived in tents, moving from place to place with his flocks, always searching for pasture and water. The tents were made of goat skin, dyed black. Although they were temporary dwellings, they were surprisingly functional. Divided into compartments by inner curtains, they offered privacy and protection from the sun and the night chill. The women's compartment, where Sarai spent most of her time, had a loom where she wove fabrics, water and oil jugs, and grain mills to make flour. Life was simple, but not devoid of a certain prosperity. Abram's flocks grew. His servants were numerous. He became a rich man, respected by the local kings, although he was still a pilgrim without land of his own. But God's promise echoed in his heart. That land would belong to his descendants. One day, his children would possess those hills, those valleys, those plains. There was only one increasingly painful problem. Where was that descendant? The years passed. 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. The promise remained unfulfilled. Abram and Sarai were growing old. Sarai's body, which had already passed childbearing age when they arrived in Canaan, was becoming increasingly unlikely to conceive. The woman's natural cycles had ceased. Humanly speaking, the possibility of having children was zero. One night, Abram poured out his heart before God. "Lord God," he cried, "what will you give me? I remain childless. The heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, a servant born in my house." The anguish in his voice was palpable. He was not questioning God, but was expressing the deep pain of seeing the promise seemingly slipping away with each passing day. Then God spoke again. And this time, he not only repeated the promise, but expanded it in a way that would take Abram's breath away. God led him outside the tent. It was night, and the desert sky was full of stars. In the absence of any light pollution, the stars shone with an intensity that we can scarcely imagine today. The Milky Way stretched like a silvery river from horizon to horizon. Constellations twinkled in every direction. "Look up at the heavens," God said, "and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Abram looked. He tried to count. 1, 10, 50, 100. It was impossible. The more he looked, the more stars he saw. Thousands, tens of thousands, an uncountable multitude scattered across the immensity of the universe. And then came the promise, "So shall your offspring be." At that moment, under that starry sky, Abram did something extraordinary. He believed in the Lord. Despite his age, despite Sarai's age, despite the biological impossibility, despite all the years of waiting, he simply believed. And the Bible records something profound. this was credited to him as righteousness. It wasn't his works, it wasn't his moral perfection, it wasn't his sacrifices or his obedience, although all of that existed. It was his faith, his trust in the God who promises and fulfills, even when everything seems impossible. God then established a covenant with Abram. It was not a simple agreement, but a sacred and binding pact. To seal this covenant, God instructed Abram to prepare a peculiar sacrifice. Abram brought a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and young pigeon. He cut the larger animals in half, placing each half opposite the other, forming a corridor. This was an ancient custom in the celebration of covenants. Both parties would pass between the pieces, symbolizing that they were committing themselves under penalty of death to fulfill the terms of the agreement. But something extraordinary happened. When the sun set and darkness fell over the place, it was God, and only God, who passed between the pieces. Represented by a smoking fire and a lit torch, God alone crossed the corridor formed by the sacrificed animals. The meaning was profound. This covenant depended solely on God. Abram did not need to pass between the pieces because the responsibility of fulfilling the promise did not fall on him, but on God himself. It was a unilateral covenant based on God's faithfulness, not on human perfection. At that solemn moment, God declared, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates." More years passed. Abram was now 99 years old. Almost a quarter of a century had passed since he had received the original promise, and there was still no son. Then God appeared to Abram again and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly." Abram fell face down, acknowledging the majesty and holiness of the one who was speaking to him. And God continued, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram, but Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The name Abram meant exalted father. But God was changing his name to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. Every time someone called him, it would be a reaffirmation of God's promise. His very name would be a constant reminder that he would be the father not just of one nation, but of many. God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah, both meaning princess, but the new name brought a renewed sense of royalty and dignity. And then came the even more specific promise, "Sarai your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." Abraham was 99 years old. Sarah was 89. The promise seemed more impossible than ever. In fact, when Abraham heard this, he fell face down and laughed. It was not a laugh of mockery, but of disbelief mixed with wonder. How could a centenarian have a child? How could a 90-year-old woman give birth? But God answered with a question that would echo through the centuries. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Some time later, Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the oaks of Mamre, in the heat of the day. It was midday, that time when the sun is at its highest point, when even the animals seek shade and men rest. Suddenly, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing before him. Even under the scorching sun, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, bowed down to the ground, and offered hospitality, as was the custom in that culture. "My lord," he said, "if now I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, wash your feet, and rest under the tree. I will bring a morsel of bread so that you may refresh yourselves." Hospitality in the ancient Middle East was sacred, and Abraham offered it generously. He ran to Sarah and asked her to prepare bread. He ran to the herd and chose a tender and good calf, giving it to a servant to prepare quickly. He brought curds, milk, and prepared meat, and served it to the visitors while they ate under the tree. Then one of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" "There, in the tent," Abraham replied. And the visitor said, "I will surely return to you in due time, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind the man who was speaking. When she heard these words, she laughed to herself. "After I am old," she thought, "and my Lord is also old, will I still have pleasure?" It was a laugh of disbelief, a laugh that hid decades of pain, of frustrated hopes, of promises that seemed eternally postponed. Sarah had come to the conclusion that she would never have children. Her body had already gone through all the changes of old age. The idea of becoming pregnant and giving birth seemed absurd, impossible, ridiculous. But then the visitor turned to Abraham and said, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Will I really have a son now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son.' Sarah, afraid, denied it. 'I did not laugh.' But he replied, 'No, you did laugh.' At that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't dealing with ordinary men. The Lord himself had visited Abraham's tent. The Lord was faithful to his word. At the appointed time, exactly as he had said, Sarah conceived. Imagine the joy, the astonishment, the wonder when she realized she was pregnant. At 90 years old, her body was experiencing something that shouldn't be biologically possible. The months passed. Her belly grew. The baby moved inside her. The reality of the miracle became more tangible each day. And then Sarah gave birth to a son. There in the tent, probably surrounded by servants who helped with the birth, with Abraham anxiously waiting outside, the impossible happened. The son of the promise was born. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs or laughter. The name was a permanent reminder of their incredulous laughter when God promised a son, but now it was a name of joy, of celebration, of the triumph of God's faithfulness over human impossibility. Sarah said, "God has given me reason to laugh, and all who hear this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The laughter of disbelief had turned into laughter of joy. The promise that seemed never to be fulfilled had finally become a reality. 25 years had passed since God's initial call to Abraham. A quarter of a century of waiting, of faith, of trust, of moments of doubt, and moments of reaffirmation. But God had fulfilled his word. The years passed. Isaac grew up. He ceased to be a baby and became a boy, then a young man. He was the joy of Abraham and Sarah. More than that, he was the very embodiment of God's promise. Through him would come the great nation. Through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. But then, something happened that would test Abraham's faith in a way that nothing before had tested it. God called, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied, as he had always done throughout all those years. And God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." Stop. Read those words again. Let their weight settle in. God was asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. The son he had waited 25 years for. The miracle son. The son of the promise. The only channel through which all of God's promises could be fulfilled. And God wasn't simply asking him to offer Isaac in service or dedication. The word used was burnt offering, a sacrifice in which the animal was completely burned on the altar. How did Abraham react? The Bible simply says, Abraham got up early in the morning. There is no record of questioning. There is no description of an anguished night. There are no words of protest or negotiation. Abraham simply obeyed. Perhaps the night had been long and sleepless. Perhaps Abraham had shed silent tears while Sarah slept beside him. Perhaps he had left the tent and looked at the stars, remembering the promise that his descendants would be like those countless points of light. How could this be fulfilled if Isaac died? But Abraham had learned something throughout all those years walking with God. He had learned that God is faithful, that God fulfills his promises, that when God speaks, he can do the impossible. The Bible tells us that Abraham believed that God had the power even to raise Isaac from the dead, if necessary. He trusted that somehow God would fulfill his promise, even if it required an even greater miracle than Isaac's birth. The next morning, Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey. He cut wood for the burnt offering. He called 2 of his servants and Isaac, his son, and they set out together for the place God had indicated to him. It was a 3-day journey, 3 days walking under the sun, 3 days of heavy silence, 3 days in which Abraham carried the weight of what he was about to do, 3 days in which he looked at Isaac walking beside him, laughing, talking, alive, and knowing what God had asked. Imagine those 3 days. The conversations around the campfire at night. Isaac, innocent, unaware of what his father was planning. the servants carefree, simply fulfilling their duty to accompany the patriarch, and Abraham heartbroken but determined to obey. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw in the distance the mountain that God had indicated. There it was, the place of sacrifice. He said to the servants, "Wait here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there. After we worship, we will come back to you." Note the words, "we will return." In the plural, Abraham still trusted that somehow he and Isaac would return together. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on Isaac, his son. He himself carried the fire and the knife. And so the two walked together, father and son, up the mountain. The silence must have been deafening. The weight of the wood on Isaac's shoulders. The weight of obedience on Abraham's heart. Then Isaac broke the silence. "My father." "Here I am, my son," Abraham replied. "Here are the fire and the wood," said Isaac, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" The innocent question must have pierced Abraham's heart like a spear. Isaac didn't know. He trusted his father. He was helping with the preparations to worship God, as they had done so many times before. Abraham answered, and his words were both a declaration of faith and a prophecy. "God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And they continued walking together. When they arrived at the place God had indicated, Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood on it. His hands worked methodically, but his heart was in turmoil. Then he turned to Isaac. We don't know exactly what happened at this moment. Isaac was young, but no longer a child. He could have resisted, but he trusted his father. And, more importantly, he also trusted his father's God. Abraham bound Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Imagine the look in both their eyes. The father looking at the son looking at the father. The love, the pain, the trust. Abraham reached out and took the knife to slay his son. His arm rose. The knife gleamed in the sun. This was the moment. There was no turning back. But then, from heaven, a voice called, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied, as he always had. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," said the angel of the Lord. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." The knife fell from Abraham's hand. Relief, gratitude, and adoration flooded his being. God had seen. God had provided. God had interrupted the sacrifice at the last possible moment. Abraham raised his eyes and looked around. There, caught by its horns in a bush, was a ram. God had provided the sacrifice, just as Abraham had told Isaac. He untied his son. They must have embraced, tears streaming down both their faces. Then Abraham took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." The promise was reaffirmed, expanded, confirmed with a divine oath. Abraham had passed the test. His faith, tested and refined through decades, had been proven genuine. He was willing to give God even what was most precious to him, trusting that God was able to fulfill his promises in any way. And God, who had never truly intended Isaac to die, but wanted to reveal what was in Abraham's heart, rewarded that extraordinary faith. Abraham and Isaac went down the mountain together. They returned to the servants who were waiting, and they went back home, where Sarah was waiting for them. The story of Abraham is the story of a man who learned to walk by faith, not by sight. A man who trusted God when everything around him said it was impossible. A man who left security and comfort to follow a divine calling. A man who waited 25 years for the fulfillment of a promise. A man who was willing to sacrifice even the most precious gift he had received, trusting that God knew what he was doing. And God was faithful. Every promise he made to Abraham was fulfilled. Through Isaac came Jacob. Through Jacob came the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Israel came kings, prophets, And finally, centuries later, in Bethlehem was born the one who was the true fulfillment of the promise that in Abraham all the families of the earth would be blessed. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, was a descendant of Abraham. And through him, the promise reached not only Israel, but all nations, all peoples, all languages. The story of Abraham teaches us that God is faithful, that his promises are true, that it is worthwhile to trust in him, even when the path is uncertain, even when the wait is long, even when the test is difficult. Abraham was called a friend of God. He was the father of a multitude. His name was magnified. And through him, through his obedience, through his faith, God's blessings reached us all. This is the story of Abraham and God's promise. An ancient story, but eternally relevant. A story of faith, obedience, patience, and trust. A story that invites us to ask ourselves, in what are we trusting? What promises of God are we waiting for? Are we willing to follow, even when we don't know where we're going? Are we willing to wait, even when the time seems too long? Are we willing to obey, even when the request seems impossible? May we, like Abraham, be men and women of faith. May we hear God's voice and obey it. May we trust in his promises, even when all circumstances say otherwise. Because the God who called Abraham, the God who promised and fulfilled, the God who tested on Mount Moriah, is the same God today. He still calls. He still promises. He is still faithful. And for him, nothing, absolutely nothing, is too difficult.